Welcome to the Lens of History. You are with Luke Herbert, speaking with special guests and placing the microscope on current and historical events.
Welcome, listeners, to this latest installment of The Lens of History. I am, of course, your host, Luke Herbert, and joining me on the couch today is author Nicholas Lambros. He is the author of a novel that is historical fiction. It is entitled To End All War, a historical novel. So, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm just fine, Luke.
Well, I'm glad. And look, we'll get right underway. Can you introduce yourself to the listener?
Yes, well, as you said, my name is Nicholas Lambros, and at 3/4 of a century, I'm old enough to remember World War II from the point of view of a 4-year-old. I served in the U.S. Army from October 1958 through February 62, and graduated from Carson Newman College in 66, after which I taught high school English in both Tennessee and Maryland. After that, I taught computer software at the 4 junior colleges in Baltimore County, where I live. And right now, I'm just retired.
And just before we move on, how useful was your Army service when it came to writing the book?
I suppose I formed some opinions about Army life while I was serving there. I found it quite different from the life I was leading prior to that time. It was very regimented, of course, and I'm always the kind of person who asks why. And as a private in the Army, you're not really supposed to do that, as you might well imagine.
Yeah, and you wrote the book to highlight the historical consequences of World War I. So can you tell us how you came about to write the book and how you came about the motivation to do so, or the reason I just mentioned?
Well, actually, I went to an antique shop up in, I think it was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and I used to buy old books, and I did buy one. I can't quite recall the name of it now, but when I got home and opened it up, a letter fell out, and I picked it up. And it was written in 1918 by a man who signed it in Monroe. And after reading the thing, it was apparent that this gentleman was a chauffeur for a couple of people who he was driving up to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And anyway, it was quite an interesting letter, and I thought to myself at the time it would make a great story. I let it alone for about a year. But then I got reinterested and started researching that time, and wound up with a 40-page chronology, and I learned quite a bit about the Great War and its impact on the 20th century, and it answered some questions I had about World War II as well. So it made me aware of its importance to later history. And I found, being an ex-teacher, that it should be brought back into importance in our classrooms.
I couldn't agree with that more, and I think the failure to do that has resulted in a lot of the events we see around the world today, particularly what's going on in the Ukraine. But just, moving us along, so I don't get too into deep or depth of current events. Can you outline the fictional and non-fictional characters in your book?
Well, there are quite a number of characters mentioned in the book. Most of them are, of course, fictional, but the characters who are military or political in nature are generally real, taken from real life. The 2 ambassadors are mentioned by name, and they were active at the time. And of course, all the military men that were in command are also mentioned by name. That would include the members of the Lafayette Escadrille, who that John Morris, the fictional main character, joined that outfit, as it turns out. His brother Michael graduates from Johns Hopkins as a surgeon and is anxious to go and do his part for the war. He becomes a naval officer and is sent to the Western Front and is encouraged to go to an aid station to see what can be done to improve care at the very first station that wounded people came into. Their younger sister, Catherine Morris, graduates from Bryn Mawr and is fluent in French. She, almost by accident, gets a job with the State Department and eventually is convinced to go to France for rather unclear reasons until she discovers that they want her to become a counter spy, which she agrees to. So those are the three main characters. There are several supporting characters under them.
And just speaking of Michael, there was a place in the book that struck me, and I'll come back to in a moment why it struck me, but around page 286 in the book, Michael meets the reality of a first aid post close to the front line. So, have you received any feedback from veterans who have been treated in field hospitals?
I haven't received anything like that from anyone who's read the book, actually. So I assume that the chapter is speaking for itself in that regard, and probably doesn't need a whole lot of explanation, especially to those people who have experienced later care in wars like Korea or elsewhere. The care back then wasn't much advanced from the care that Americans received in the Civil War, although some treatments were improved upon. It was not that great. They didn't have a lot of the kinds of drugs that we have nowadays to give to patients.
The reason why that part of the book really struck me, and just perhaps your first bit of feedback in this kind of light, is that my father was seriously injured in Vietnam, was serving the Australian contingent, more accurately the Australian Task Force, and he would have been treated at a field hospital before he was flown home to Australia. So, that part of the book just really struck me for that reason. It was, obviously Michael's a fictional character, but, it could be said there was some relation, if you like, to, what's happened to members of my family.
Well, first of all, I appreciate your father's service, and I'd like you to mention that to him for me, if you would. As I said, the care back in World War I was rather crude, and there were several aid stations that could have been a wounded person could have been processed through. The seriously injured eventually wound up in hospitals where they were given more comprehensive surgeries and prostheses and such, and that goes further. That's further explained in the book, actually, with the supporting character James Jefferson, who's a fictional character who gets wounded seriously in the leg and has to learn how to use a false leg.
Yeah, and I don't think people today really appreciate just how crude the artificial limbs were back then. You certainly, if you read the book Reach for the Sky about the famous British airman Douglas Bader, or you see the film, it's quite enlightening. But just sort of shifting gears here, and I was going to ask this towards the end of the interview, but I think this is a good time to bring it up. Do you have any plans for a sequel that could feature an artillery captain by the name of Harry Truman?
Well, not Harry Truman, I'm afraid. Although I admire Truman as the president who said the buck stops here, I don't particularly agree with his decision to use atomic bombs near the end of World War II. I think by that time, Japan was pursuing an end of the war through Russian contacts. But as for sequels, for the other characters, I'm considering carrying John and Catherine into World War II, and James Jefferson might become a lawyer and go to the South in the early 30s, which is was a very prejudiced South at that time. They were hanging blacks for very little cause at all. So he may get involved in that. I'm not real sure yet. Writing a novel is not the easiest thing I've ever done. This one was compiled over 20 years, so it's not something you want to lightly get into if you want to do it right.
The one thing I would like to see, and this is just my own personal perspective on World War One, because I first read about the conflict when I was a kid, I would actually like to see a fictional American naval observer taking notes at the Battle of Jutland, just to give the naval angle to a novel. But that's just
it's a great idea, and I'm sure the British would appreciate it as well. That battle was essentially called a draw. Both sides claimed victory. The German Navy never really reappeared after that battle, so I guess it was more a British victory than a German one.
Yeah, and I just think it would be interesting to have a character taking notes in their perspective on that Titanic battle that, as you say, it didn't have a clear decisive result. But moving back towards the character of Catherine, what factors were involved when you created the character of Catherine?
Well, the letter that I found in that old book, Monroe's letter, which is incidentally reproduced in a novel, mentions Miss Morris. And so it kind of necessitated her inclusion in the novel. And she offers a kind of a balance against the other characters who are somewhat more active in the war than she would be. And she, of course, gives the female point of view of the war, which is somewhat more close to my own view of that war. Her non-combatant role, and as well as Michael's, does offer that balance. And war has a kind of sort of balance. There's life and there's death, and there's commanders giving orders and chaplains giving advice, or soldiers fighting and medics healing. So a novel like that, I think, benefits from that kind of balance. You don't want to, stay on one side of the issue and pound people to death with that idea. So I think it balances the entire book.
And moving back towards the start of the book, on page 36, Albert, who's a character the reader will have to discover for themselves, is suddenly discussing casualties on the Western Front, and he's talking to John. Can you tell us about how you came to write the scene?
Well, John, of course, winds up in England at first, although he eventually wants to go to France to fly in the Lafayette Escadrille. But he winds up there at first and finds himself in London, and when he gets off the train, he goes to St. Paul's for a little while, then comes out and finds a taxi to try to take him to the American embassy, where he hopes to get some help in achieving his goal. Albert takes him home and gives him dinner, and then they go out to the tavern, and then they're chatting, and the tavern, of course, revolves around the topic of the day, which is the war. And so both of them kind of express their own ideas and reasons for why they feel that way, and so it's kind of a sounding board, if you will, for some of my thoughts on the war, and of course those characters as well. I should tell you that as I was writing the book, I could hear the characters speaking to me. It was almost like I was just writing down what they said. So that helped quite a bit in forming the story itself.
And one passage of the book that caught my interest was on a World War II part. But in this section of the book, Michael meets one Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall, How much research did you do into Marshall's character before you wrote the book?
Well, I'm not too sure how many people have access to it, but I read a book which was entitled George C. Marshall, Interviews and Reminiscences for Forrest C. Progue, copyrighted in 1986 by the George C. Marshall Research Foundation. And so it's a compilation of interviews with Marshall himself. And I followed the book, or at least read the book, up through the time when he went to France and was attached to Pershing's general staff in Chaumont.
The sense I get of Marshall from what I've read over the years is that not many people got close to him. He was very almost coldly formal in the sort of what you'd come to expect from the Victorian era. You know, today you'd almost think he was, I don't know, I don't want to call him out of place, but you expect people to be a little more open and, well, I don't want to use the term friendly in military circles, but did you then find that was the case with Marshall, or did you find an impression in your own mind about him?
I guess I do. In some regard, there was an old television show produced here in America called "This Is Your Life." I forget who was hosting it, but at one point they got Marshall on there and discussed his life. Now you got to remember he was a graduate of West Point, and in a day when we weren't that far removed from the Civil War, only maybe a generation or so. So he was what in the Army we would call a pure soldier. That in mind, and the fact that he was an officer and in command of people, would make him necessarily appear stiff. And of course, in World War II, he was the highest general officer who remained in the States. Eisenhower, of course, took care of the ETO and became the commanding general of all forces over there. But Marshall was always there at home, and I think was probably consulted often enough, I assume, by Eisenhower or at least the president of the United States, who was also there, of course. I'm assuming it's just that his background made him look a little more starchy than most. So I suppose that's basically my opinion of him.
Yeah, I think he was a soldier's soldier as well. And, you know, you've mentioned how the history of World War I hasn't been taught in schools and perhaps learnt. Well, I think the role of George Marshall in World War II also fits into that category. I don't want to comment too much on current and recent events in this interview, but certainly I think if you look at the relationships between US presidents and commanding generals, say in Iraq or Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the last, I don't know, since let's say 2002 for the present, I think you can draw the contrast between the way Marshall worked with FDR. So I'm just going to put that out to the listener there for food for thought. So is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, the historical consequences of World War I need to be examined more thoroughly. It was, of course, the first global war and the most costly up at that time in history, not only in money but in lives. Over 9 million combatants died at least. Historians estimate somewhere between 6 and 10 million civilians lost their lives. And if you add the Spanish flu, which was spread throughout the trenches of the war and then carried by soldiers back to the populations where they lived, another 60 to 100 million people died from that. And of course, with the dissolution of 3 monarchies, particularly the Tsar in Russia, communism was born, which eventually brought Stalin to power, and then Stalin killed at least 2 million people before World War II even got started, many of them military officers. And when you start adding up the cost, that was almost a direct result of that war. It comes to be equal to the population of the United States in 1914, and that's a lot of people. So the fact that the Ottoman Empire was taken over by mostly by the British, and Prince Faisal's wishes were never realized, and properties countries were made without too much concern over tribal or religious concerns. And Lord Balfour promises a Jewish homeland during the war, which eventually happens in 1948, and that leads to the problems that we have today in the Middle East. It's these kinds of things that I think need to be researched and talked about and discussed and realized, to really appreciate the impact of that war and what it had on history, even up to today.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I would encourage the listener who hasn't read about World War I to do so. And I also think, you could say the same about the interwar years. I think too have a lot of lessons that, haven't been absorbed, particularly the rise of Nazi Germany and, the role of opposing the Treaty of Versailles, the payments on Germany, what happens to society when it's in the economic dumps, you get radicalization, that the wrong people, nobody has particularly paid much attention to those lessons, and, that's playing out today. But thank you very much for joining us in the Lens of History Studio.
Well, it's a pleasure having this talk with you. I hope that readers find the novel worth reading, and that they become engrossed by the characters as they learn something about the Great War. I hope they develop an appreciation for that time in history and leave with a renewed awareness of the impact that war had on the generations that followed. And thank you very much.
You have been listening to The Lens of History with Luke Herbert.